Hi, it's Diane from SewBatik. Today we are going to make a chenille scarf, and I'm wearing one and I absolutely love it. This one I actually have kind of wrapped around my neck twice, but this one here is made from, of course, all of them are, Batik Rayon, and this one is called The Color of Lake, and it started out looking very similar to this fabric, which has a little bit of kind of browns and gold shades in it, blues and turquoises. So a fabric that kind of looks very, it's got a motif on it and really, really pretty. You lose the motif, but you get this amazing rich color that turns into your chenille scarf. And the chenille scarf itself, let me see how long they really are. Depending on how you make it, yours might be more or less, but this measures from point of tassel about 62 inches, but from the portion that is actually the physical scarf, it's about 50 inches or so. And I have, like I said, this one is wrapped around twice. So these just make wonderful gifts, or you just wear it. It's the perfect season to just wrap yourself in a scarf just to kind of take away a little bit of that cool edge. But let's get started. What we need for the scarf, and we do sell chenille scarf kits on our website. I have a little bit of thread here. And you can get them in any one of the Batik Rayons that we have in stock. So even if we have a kit that doesn't have the right color that you would like to make a scarf from or gift a scarf, then just let us know and we'll make a custom kit for you as well. We do that all the time. But the kit comes with 1.5 yards of Batik Rayon and the pattern. You will also need a chenille cutter of some sort. There's so many on the market. I like to use the Olfa chenille cutter, but we also have one called from Havel that's on our website, and that actually you grip more like you would a rotary cutter. So they're each a little bit different, so you have to pick the style that works best for you ergonomically, and for some reason the Olfa blade is just perfect for myself. You also need a rotary cutter. You'll need a ruler, a long ruler, and a marking pencil. I use a Bowen, and I'm going to use it because it's got the white lead in it, and this one's perfect for me. And this is like an optional product, but the basting adhesive I like to use instead of pins. Pins and my fingers just don't seem to go together very well sometimes. But if you don't have any kind of basting adhesive that you can spray on, then definitely grab your pins, because you'll need those, or clips as well, but each one will work just fine. Once you open up your package, or if you have 1.5 yards at home, make sure that you do iron your fabric, because we want to make sure that everything is flat when we start cutting the strips that go into the scarf. Now, before I actually do this, I do want to say one more thing. The scarf, and let me describe it just a little bit so that you get the general concept of what we're trying to do. The scarf itself is made up of 7 layers of fabric. So there's 7 layers, and as you would expect, this is a reversible scarf. The middle layer, which is, I'm going to call just the middle layer, is the only layer that's never cut. It's holding this entire scarf together. And so there are 3 layers of fabric on top of the middle layer. And then on the reverse side, there's 3 more layers. So we're going to be cutting the fabric into strips, and we cut them on the bias. Because if you were to cut straight of grain or cross grain and stitch all that together and then open up the threads on top, it would fall apart. So we need the bias weave to keep the scarf together. So always remember that we're going to cut this on the bias. And we're going to cut these into strips. We're going to stack them up. and then we're going to sew across them. That's how we get what I call channels. And then we're going to open up those channels using the chenille scarf cutter or chenille cutter. And we'll go through each one of those steps along the way. To start, we need to make sure that the fabric is on the bias. So open up our fabric, and from one corner, we're going to fold it to the other edge. I like to keep the fold right next to me here and right where I'm going to be cutting, because we want to reduce the amount of times we move the fabric. Okay, let me pull this back a little bit. So now I'm going to pull that over there. There we go. And I don't have a ruler this long. So very, very easily, we want to pull the fabric onto itself, like so, straightening as you go. And my ruler is still not this long, so I'm going to fold it in one more time. Recenter that and straighten. Take the time that you need to get this straight, because this is probably what's going to be the most important step, is the fabric has to be on the bias, and we want to make sure it's a true bias. So I'm going to match my folds one more time here, pull this up, and then we will start cutting our strips. I'm actually going to lift this up for a moment. There we go. Just shimmy this down. There we go. Don't want it to pull, and it's wanting to pull. There we go. So now, our pattern tells us to measure, and remember, we're cutting the first on a fold. We're going to measure, each strip is 5 1/4 inches wide. So we need to cut the first strip at 2 5/8. Set this one aside, and remember that this is your very, very first strip. We're going to continue cutting 5 1/4 inches until all of the fabric has been cut. Get that up there. There we go. And I actually move them and stack them up. And then once I start using the strips to make my layers, I take them off in the opposite sequence. And I'll show you why in a minute. And keep cutting. I'm going to pull this forward very easily here, or gingerly, so I don't stretch across the table. But the less you move your fabric once you've started cutting, the better. I think there's only 2 left. And I cut the entire piece of fabric. We won't use this piece, but we will use most of the rest. So now start unfolding each one of the strips that we've cut, and we'll know the length of each one of them. And I'm just going to stack these up by the length of them so I know how to piece them all together. And I really shouldn't be using the word piece because we're not sewing anything, but you'll see why I said that in a moment. But you get a lot of strips. And you will use pretty much all of them. This one goes into that grouping, and this one is super long again. And then the very first strip set that we cut will have the next longest grouping in them. Like that. So we go from, we end up with something this narrow to this long, okay? I'm going to slide these up on my table just to get them sort of out of my way. You may not be able to see them on the camera, but now back to the very first one. The very first strip was the one that we cut on the fold, and that is our center. Let's take that piece and put it back on our table. And one thing that I always do is I want to make sure that I'm not pulling the strip too far before I start layering my fabric, because it is a bias strip. And when you pull it to lay it down, it's getting narrower and narrower this way. We want to keep it at the 5 1/4 inches that we cut it at, okay? So that is going to be the center of our scarf. I take my pencil and I just put a C on each end, just so that for some reason, I mean, all the fabric looks alike. I just always want to make sure that that is my center and remains my center. And you can write on these because it's going to get cut off once we clean up the scarf. Okay, that can lay that back down again. Now, personally, I don't use pins on this particular project. Pins and my fingers don't go together very well. So I use the basting adhesive, which again is optional, but I like to use it simply because it keeps the layers from moving. And once we finish chenille cutting it with our chenille cutter, we wash it. And so it takes out any of that, the adhesive that was used when we made it. So I just kind of take this and I just put little dots on it so that it will become a little bit tacky when I put my layers on. Now, how do we select which layers to put down? I do give this a little bit of thought. As you can see, all the layers are different lengths. I keep the longest, the next longest 2 layers for last. And I put, so these are going to be the 2 layers that I want to just keep for the last steps. I take the next longest layer and remember, we put spray adhesive down, so it's going to tack to it just a little bit. But I layer it reversed because each end has a little bit of an angle to it. But I layer it reversed to what was on the bottom here, the center strip, and just lay it down. Okay, it will move on you. And just lay it on the center. And I spread it out again to make sure that it stays on the center of that particular shape. Now, this did not reach the end of our strip. So then I go back and find the shortest strip and add it to it. And remember, it doesn't matter how many layers you put down on here. We're using that chenille cutter, and everything is going to end up chenilling the same way. We don't piece these together, we just layer them on top of each other. So then I take this piece and I just stage it just a little bit on top of the other one, and then it reaches the end. And then I cut off the little point, so I know that that is a layer. Use a little bit more spray adhesive. Ooh, this isn't working so great. I think my can is a little bit old. I'm going to wipe that off here. We'll go without that for now. And take the next layer of fabric. And I start on the side that I already have a little bit of a crossover on here. And lay it in position. Okay. Try to keep your layers as straight as possible. And I had a little bit left over here, so I am going to use this one little piece from the very, very end to finish off that layer. Next, I have one more to do. And I'm going to start over on this side. No, I'm not. I'm going to put the long one on. I don't remind myself what I'm doing, because now this is layer number 3. So I will lay that all the way across. So my top layer always is pretty equal to the center layer, the length of the center layer. And then I'm going to clip that off again so I know that that's my 3 layers. So now this side has 3 layers on it. I am going to pin this now because my adhesive isn't really working very well. So let me just put a couple of pins in. Before we turn it. And I'm going to do an extra one at the end here and clip off my ends. There we go. I use my ruler to help me turn this. I set it right in the middle and I lay that on top and this edge on top, and I'm going to turn it over laying it down on that side. And then I just sort of lift it over and lay it flat. Of course, that didn't work that time. What am I doing here? Okay, so let's just do it by hand. Okay. Now we do the same thing to this side, layering everything as we go. So now I start with one of the shorter pieces. Again, over on that side, keeping it as wide as it should be there. Don't pull it. And then I need just a little bit more on that end. I think that's too small, so we're going to use this one. Layer it there. And then I'm going to trim this off. Okay, so there's one layer. And then I come back over here on this side because that's where my layer was. Make sure that it stays 5 1/4. And then I'm going to need a little longer one here, which is this one. Flip it over so it matches the angle. And keep it straight. There we go. And I'm going to clip this end off too. Now, our last layer is going to be the other longest strip. Okay. There we go. And I'm going to trim that so I know which one this is. And I can still see the center one that has my little C on it. There we go. And now I'll pin this layer together, or this side together, and I'm going to put the pins towards the outside edges this time, because the next step that we take is to sew all of these layers together. My scarf is turning on me. There we go. And then I'm going to put one, I have to always finish and put one layer or one pin right at the end. There we go. Now we have 7 layers of fabric. The C is the one that has the center on each side, so we know which one is the center, and then 3 layers on each side. The next step helps me out a lot, and it is, I need to mark the center of the long scarf so I know where to start stitching on my sewing machine. And the one thing to always, I don't know if I mentioned this ahead of time, but make sure that your sewing machine has a walking foot. So change that out, put your walking foot on. Just, it will make it easier for all the layers to go through your sewing machine as you're stitching. And I actually use, it's not necessarily the smallest stitch length that you would for stitching your seams on a quilt or on your garment, but mine is set to I know the numbers aren't all the same, but it's in the middle. It's probably a 2.8 on my machine. So it's not a basting stitch, which is more like a 4, but it is also not the teeny tiny stitch, because you are, again, going through so many layers that we just want to make sure that we're not really killing our machine. And I still use the 12 or 80-12 needle for my, and it's a Microtex needle. And I'm also using polyester cotton thread on mine. So that's what I'm using to stitch my scarf together. So the next step is we're going to put a center line down the middle. That's where I'm going to start sewing. And then we're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch away from that center line, going all the way across our scarf. And once I get to an end, I take that end and I turn it and I come down the other way. And then I go down, I turn it again, and I come back down on the other side of the stitch line. I build from the middle and work out as I sew. And then you're going to get to the very edge. Just keep stitching until you really aren't catching any more of the layers. And we'll clean all that up at the end. It's going to look kind of interesting after you stitch this up, but we clean it up before we do anything more with it. So I'm going to do my mark and we'll see you in a minute. We are back, and you have just spent a lot of time sewing all of these, what I call our channels. And my goodness, it does take a little bit of time, and it's a very good project for those that want to try to improve your straight stitching technique. I can tell you that. But we're back, and your scarf now looks pretty flat. It looks sewn. The edges are uneven. And our next task is to use your chenille cutter to open up each one of these channels, okay? So I do one thing though, you know, every single time I make one of these, I may or may not sew the exact same distance that I did the last time. I really try to keep it about 3/8 of an inch. But if it isn't, I just need to make sure that I use the right foot, because if you're using one of the Olfa blades or Olfa chenille cutters, we need to find the right width of the foot here that fits into the channel. And I also look at it as almost, it needs to fit the snuggest, okay? So most of the time I am using the one that is a medium, but it might change depending on how wide your space is between the threads. So measure or just set the foot down on top of one of the distances and just test it in various places to make sure that it fits the best, because you may have to reduce the it might be narrower or wider, so you may have to change which one of the feet go through the channel. Same thing with any of the other chenille cutters that are like Havel is a handled one, and you put on a different foot. So it's the same concept, just a different utility, okay? So what I'm going to do with this one is I think I'm going to keep it at a medium. I'm going to turn this, and you turn the dial to make sure you are opening the right one. Actually, I have to go back to this one. So you see that the blade is open for the foot that you want to go through your channel. And remember which one is your center, because that's the one that we're not going to cut. That has to stay solid. And I think I have it Yep, my C is still on each one of these. And then you take your cutter and simply start going right through the fabric. If for some reason this is not going through nicely and snug and really straight, you still have the time to stop what you're doing and switch feet to a wider one if you need to, because we do really want it to be snug. It keeps the blade straight through the channel. So that really is something that you need to pay attention to, because once you wash this, we want all of the threads to be the same height. Okay, so you just take it, and then I actually just double check and make sure I've got 3 layers in there, and that's exactly what I have. And you just keep going through all the way across. Flat against your table is how I use this one. Again, if you're using a different chenille cutter, follow the instructions that come with that particular tool. And you just keep doing this cutting until all of the channels are open. You may hit a snag now and again. You could, where you joined or overlaid some of the fabric. That is really one of the reasons why, for me, that I always take the second 2 longest strips and make sure that those are on the top, the outside of each side of the scarf. That is why I do that, because I don't want to have to make sure that I'm cutting through that join spot, and that we're not doing anything wrong with that. And it keeps everything inside the scarf. So I'm just going to do a couple more of these, but this is how simple it is to go through the rayon. If for some reason it pulls or it's not cutting right, then we might have a blade issue. Your blade might have already become dull. If that's the case, then there's 2 little dials on this particular device, and it says turn to get a new edge on your blade, turn the other way to select the size guide that you are going to use. So there's a lot of life to this particular blade, but they all do run out if you do a lot of projects with your chenille cutter. Okay, so just keep cutting through here. If you don't have a chenille cutter, I have to tell you, at one point in time I had to do something really, really quickly, and I attempted to use a seam ripper. Be very careful, because you're going to poke a hole eventually through it. Or I've seen people use really, really sharp scissors to go through it. But I can honestly tell you that whether you buy ours or whether you go to another retail store to purchase one, find a coupon, do whatever you need to do, they're well worth the price to have. Okay? So now I flip this over and you do the same thing all the way through. Every single channel on both sides. Okay? When that's done, I'm going to set that aside. And what we need to do now, actually I'm just going to, is straighten the edges here. So grab a rotary cutter and use your stitch line as your guide. Okay? I cut about between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch off, leaving that much next to the last stitch line. Because once your scarf goes through the wash, you still want a little bit of that edge to fray. as well. So that's what I did, is I really kept it close, but not too close. Just be careful that you don't cut off the stitch line. Just going to trim this one side up. So you can see what I'm doing. And take the time to do this for sure, really carefully. Because you put a lot of work into this, you don't want to cut anything off now and make it a very, very narrow scarf. The other tidbit and tip that I have often used as well is when I'm making that center, the very, very first cut, the center cut, when I'm cutting off the fold, on the fold, if you make that strip just a little wider than 2 5/8, you'll also always know where the center is, because that layer will be wider than the 3 that you lay on the top and on the bottom. Okay, so that edge is now straight. The next thing that you want to do is decide how you want to finish off the end. The scarf that I'm wearing, we just did an angled tassel. Okay. And these all curl after you dry it in the dryer. So there was nothing special here at all. What I did is I trimmed. Now I'm looking at both sides. This one is angled here with the fabric, and this one, oh, we can get away with that. So we'll just cut this right along there. Actually, I'm going to go a little bit further down. Actually, not. A little bit further, I think I'm going to go. And if it's not a perfect 45-degree angle, that's fine. And then we're going to cut, might want to use your scissor for this, up the center of each one of these to get each one of the tassels, okay? Before I do that, I do need to finish cutting, okay? So we'll finish cutting that and then we'll cut up. With all of that done, you take this and you put it in the washer and the dryer, and you get this amazingly beautiful, soft, fuzzy chenille scarf. I really, really hope you give this a try. It's very simple. It's very fun. It's a lot of straight stitching, but it's a great gift and for yourself to wear as well. So we hope you enjoy this tutorial. And if you have any questions, definitely send us a note, send us an email, give us a call, and enjoy.